This is Greg Troutwine with Offshore Engineer TV, and we're very pleased to be joined again by Philip Lewis, the Director of Research for World Energy Reports and the author of The Outlook for Offshore Wind Power, the Frontier of Future Energy. Phil, last week, or the last time that we were able to interview, we discussed floating offshore wind. And while floating wind is still in its formative years, it holds some of the biggest potential for the offshore wind sector as a whole. For those who might have missed it, can you give us a brief recap of why you see this scenario?
Sure. Simply put, Greg, the potential is huge, with some 80% of technical wind potential to be found in water depths more suited to floating wind turbines, which is generally seen as over 60 meters. Deeper water generally sees higher capacity factors, allowing for increased productivity. IEA identified the global average capacity factors for onshore wind farms as 25%, on offshore bottom fixed as 33%, although we at World Energy Reports expect to see that rise to 40 to 50% with the larger wind turbines that are being planned now. For floating offshore wind, we expect to see 50 to 60% capacity factors, the highest for power generation from wind. At World Energy Reports, we are tracking a pipeline of over 66 gigawatts of floating wind projects, which will create significant supply chain opportunities from ship and offshore yards to concrete precast and in situ contractors, ports, anchor manufacturers, mooring chain and rope suppliers, and OSV companies. In addition to floating wind providing grid electrical power, at World Energy Reports, we are excited by the potential for offshore wind, and in particular floating wind to decarbonise oil and gas operations, as with the Hywind Tampen captive power project and off-grid hydrogen production, as will be demonstrated at the Kincardine project.
Phil, in the COVID-19 world, it seems like a very small world, but obviously it's still a very large world indeed. When you look out across the globe geographically, where do you see the best opportunities for floating offshore wind in the midterm?
Well, Greg, there are actually 33 floating wind projects that have or which are testing the technology at scale, at full-size demonstration, and at multi-turbine pilot arrays in 13 countries. At World Energy Reports, we're particularly excited about France, the UK, Norway, South Korea, Japan, and the USA, due to the promotion of demonstration and pilot projects and developing pipelines and tender plans for floating wind leases. The visibility of the pipeline should in turn provide better visibility to the supply chain of the possibilities that exist.
Phil, as you have discussed, growth in the floating offshore wind sector will also have a strong tie and an impact for various aspects of construction,
Yeah.
logistics, and the maritime market. Can you take a deep dive on some of the opportunities that you see with some all-important insights on when?
Yeah, no, thanks, Greg. World Energy Reports, we're undertaking a detailed analysis on all major elements of the floating wind supply chain, including yard and port capacity to manufacture and assemble the substructures, the mooring system element, manufacturing opportunities and challenges, and the vessels that will tow the substructures, pre-lay the moorings, and hook up the floating turbines, which will come from the OSV fleet. It's often said that an advantage of floating wind is that it does not rely on the high day rate bottom fixed wind turbine installation vessels and the new generation heavy lift fleet. World Energy Reports, our deep dive into this element of the project construction process, indicates that there is a potential supply side bottleneck. Allow me to explain in more depth. Based on our pipeline forecast, a simple high-level analysis shows a high, mid, and low case for substructures to be towed and anchors to be set. The analysis shows a relatively low level of activity up until 2025, followed by an upswing in the second half of this decade and a major jump in activity in the next decade. Now let's look at the equipment that's being used or is being used on the four largest floating wind projects to date: Windfloat Atlantic, Kincardine, Hywind Scotland, and Hywind Tampen. The vessels used on the projects include some of the largest anchor handlers and construction vessels in the fleet, where 15,000 horsepower anchor handlers is a general, but not exclusive, lower power requirement. Now, these vessels generally support oil and gas operations and will continue to do so. Active utilisation of the large over 15,000 horsepower anchor handling fleet is around 60%, and an estimated 30% of the fleet is in long-term layup or cold stack. In short, there's not actually a very large base of available vessels to support the growth of floating wind installations. We see limited locally flagged UK, South Korean, Japanese, and US anchor handling tonnage in the large scale by some of the major floating wind markets. And this presents sales and purchase and/or new build opportunities for these highly prospective markets. However, we must note that this industry has been severely challenged by low utilization and day rates for many years, with many owners facing financial difficulties and restructuring, resulting in a lower appetite for new investment. We see the Norwegian market, the UK, and the wider European and US markets relatively well supplied with the construction vessels. But again, many of these will continue to support deep water oil and gas operations, and so there are limits on the available capacity for floating wind. Further, we see a potential shortage of sufficient skilled and handling crew, especially where local content crew requirements need to be met and within our forecast timelines. We do see some efforts to mitigate the supply side challenge, which include lighter substructures and enhanced mooring solutions to allow for lower monopole requirements, potentially opening up the supply opportunity to the large number of anchor handlers less than 15,000 horsepower. So in short, it's interesting times lie ahead for OSV owners.
Phil, as always, I truly appreciate your time and your insights, and I wish you a good weekend.
Thanks, Greg, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.